This is the Coach Mentor Podcast, proudly brought to you by Fraser Holmes and Associates, making the most of your greatest asset. This podcast covers a wide range of topics related to the coaching industry, interviews with industry leaders, coaching experts, and exploring areas of expertise closely related to the coaching industry. Here's your host, Robert Holmes.
Great to have you join us at the Coach Mentor Podcast. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the issue of positive psychology with Dr. Suzy Green. Suzy is the founder of the Positivity Institute, an affiliate of the Wellbeing Institute based in the University of Cambridge. Suzy is an adjunct research fellow at the ACU, an associate professor at the University of Western Sydney, a fellow of the Black Dog Institute, an honorary fellow to the Melbourne Graduate School of Education based in the University of Melbourne, a board member of the Reach Foundation, and she's on the advisory board of the Helmsman Project. Suzy holds a BA in psychology with honours, a master's in clinical psychology, a doctorate in clinical psychology, and has done doctoral research on evidence-based life coaching and positive psychology interventions. So, now for the interview. Well, good morning, Suzy.
Oh, good morning, Robert.
I hope it's well there. I notice Sydney's been getting some wild weather.
It's certainly wild here in Sydney this morning.
So before we get into talking about positive psychology, which is a field some of our listeners I'm sure are familiar with and others may not have heard of, I'd love to explore your journey a bit. We can go back as far as you like. Perhaps when you left school, where were you headed?
I actually didn't quite know, Robert. So I left school when I was 16. I was passionate about horse riding at the time and didn't do a lot of study. And so sort of in those days, it was pretty typical, I guess, from the area that I grew up in, that females in particular went into nursing, teaching in particular, or secretarial studies. So I did secretarial studies, which in many ways has set me up with a lot of fantastic skills now in the business that I run. But I ended up going back to uni as a mature age student when I was around 24, 25, I think.
Okay, and what subject did you select?
I studied psychology because my fiance at the time was doing medicine and moving into psychiatry, and so he used to come home and talk about it, and I was just absolutely intrigued. And so I ended up, in those days you could just sort of sit an exam to get into uni if you hadn't done HSC, and to my surprise I got in, and I did a whole range of different subjects, but I just excelled in psychology, and I think that was because I just loved it. And of course I had someone that I could talk to that was also interested in the field, which I think really helped me in those early days.
Yeah. And in those early days, was there any particular part of psychology that stood out to you as being most interesting?
Well, because I guess, my partner was doing psychiatry, it was really the clinical realm, and that's where my early career started. Even after I, graduated, my first job was in a psychiatric clinic. So again, I've sort of come, a long way into coaching from those very early days in being interested in the clinical spectrum.
Yeah. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with what marks out clinical work as different from something else, or even psychiatry, could you sort of define those out from psychology for us?
Yeah, so I guess it's people that are really quite distressed and disordered, and may have been given a diagnosis of, under the DSM-5 as it currently stands, but generally people that are certainly not feeling great and are not functioning well at all, to the point where for some clients that was, they couldn't really even get out of bed, so very different again to the group of people that I, have now work with in an executive coaching spectrum. So quite psychiatrically unwell.
Right. So mentally unwell, or struggling with mental disorders or personality disorders.
That's right, schizophrenia and clinical depression, but really at the extremes, more so than, I guess, these days, as even clinical psychologists or psychologists, we would say that depression is, the common cold of psychology, and we'll probably get to it, but it does occur, obviously comes up in coaching at times too because of its prevalence.
Yeah, and I'd love to mark that as a topic for how coaches should deal with perhaps mental health issues when they turn up in a coaching spectrum. So let's remember to cover that.
Okay.
So then, at some point, you moved over to lecturing at Sydney University.
Yeah, so again, I was doing a doctorate in clinical psychology, and initially I was going to do a study on schizophrenia, and there just happened to be a talk by our local Australian Psychological Society and a couple of male psychologists that did a talk on life coaching, and I'd sort of been watching what had been happening in the media. So this is sort of the early 2000s, 2001 I started that doctorate. And I went along, and my supervisor was there, Dr. Lindsay Odes, and I sort of looked at him and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, we use these same sorts of techniques even with psychiatric patients to a degree, like obviously quite differently, but we use goal setting and we look at motivation. And so it's really a lot of the similar psychological techniques, but using them for a more of a functioning population." So to cut a long story short, while all of my colleagues were studying depression and schizophrenia and anxiety, I ran a life coaching study for my doctorate in clinical psychology, which was unheard of in those days. And our argument is that our role is to prevent mental illness and also to promote mental well-being. And again, if I look over the last 10 years, it's changing, thankfully. It's still got a way to go in terms of psychology being more in that space. But it was quite groundbreaking at the time.
What a wonderful admission or a statement that many of the tools are shared, because I've heard from the other side, going to a coaching school or a coaching masterclass, the admission being made, hey, we've stolen all the best tools that we could find, and most of them come from psychology and psychiatry. So it's great to see that, that hand in hand rather than a competitive view. And you're right, it is changing.
That's right. So, obviously in psychology, the expertise around behavioural change and around mood. And although, again, as you would know, a lot of psychology is focused on the deficit and weakness, and coaching so much more aligned with solutions and strengths. And so that's, much more of a natural fit for me personally too.
Yeah. So you did your doctorate and you continued lecturing at university in applied psychology. Were you able to blend in some of the learning about life coaching into those lecture series?
Yeah, well, when Tony Grant, who's still the director of the coaching psychology unit, as you would know, and that was the world's first coaching psychology unit that was set up in 2000. So it was good timing for me too, because Tony was my secondary supervisor on my research. And so he asked me to write a subject in 2004 called Personal and Work-Life Coaching, because a lot of the subjects at Sydney Uni were very executive and workplace focused. So my subject was more about looking at coaching, across the lifespan, for children, adolescents, and, the different ages and phases that we go through. And but after about 4 years, I think, because positive psychology was simultaneously growing and the research was coming out, and it was so relevant to personal and life coaching and coaching broadly, we renamed it to Applied Positive Psychology. And that's the subject that is continued to be taught now by Dr. Sean O'Connor, who took over from me. So in the coaching masters, the students usually have done a couple of subjects on introduction to coaching theories and techniques, coaching practice. And then when they come in to do Applied Positive Psych, it just sits beautifully on top of the coaching skills. So they're just perfect partners.
Well, why don't we turn now to the topic of positive psychology and explore, I guess, firstly, where that originally came from.
Yeah. So it really, I guess, even though the term, if you track the history back, I think it was Maslow, even in the 50s, that coined the term, but it was Professor Martin Seligman that formally launched the field in 1998 when he was president of the American Psychological Association, and basically had said the time has come for psychology to focus on what's right with people rather than what's wrong. And he has done an amazing job, I believe, for psychology as a profession and also in taking it out to the broader public. Although I do have concerns that the people in the public, general public, know more about it than students studying psychology at the moment, and hopefully that's going to change over time. But that field, as I said, launched in 98 and has continued to grow and continues to grow now to this day. And the area that I've really, I guess, positioned myself in is the integration of coaching psychology as a field with positive psychology as a field.
So would you say that the main thing about positive psychology, as Martin Seligman puts it, is to concentrate on what is going well for people rather than concentrate on what's broken, what's weak, what needs fixing?
Yeah, I think it is a large part of it, but sometimes you find people get into that sort of black and white, thinking. And I even had a client years ago when I said to him, I'm going to work a little bit differently. He was more on the counselling clinical side, and I said, I'm going to be focusing more on his strengths. And he said, "Oh goodness, Susie, if you focus on my strengths, what will happen to my weaknesses?" And so I sort of suggested to him that we wouldn't disregard areas for development, but we'd bring a strengths focus to those to help develop those areas, but also play to his strengths, which are more natural and easier to apply.
That's great.
Yeah.
So you've begun to bring together or blend the two, life coaching or coaching psychology and positive psychology. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so again, I think it really came through that experience of teaching, and at the same time I was teaching, because I'm primarily a practitioner. As much as I taught that as an adjunct lecturer for 10 years, most of my time was building, working in a business and consulting and running programs. And since about 2006, I've been working in schools, which is its own field, positive education, that's developed. But often, I'd only get 1 day or a maximum of 3 days to work, say, with staff in schools, teachers, or in the corporate setting. And what I really discovered was, well, particularly in education, teachers hadn't learnt any skills relating to coaching, which, at its very basic is about how to bring out the best in people. And then to try and teach them coaching skills and positive psychology in 1 to 3 days is a little challenging sometimes. Whereas if you've already done some coaching training and have had some practice at it, it's so much easier to apply the positive psych. And on the other hand, I've seen investments in positive psychology, quite large investments by some organisations, and I sort of wonder, what, the takeaway from training is less than 10%, and, the investment in a coaching model could really enhance, and does really enhance, that transfer of knowledge from training. So I think it's a concern that people invest in training and positive psychology training without having the coaching to really bring it to life.
And without the coaching, then, as you said, there's sort of 10% take-up or 10% recall. Yeah. And so when you blend the two, it goes deeper, it lasts longer, there's more change.
That's it. And I think the other big piece, which, again, probably in the community, there's some confusion. There still is confusion around coaching being sort of rah-rah, reach your goals, and which, it is obviously about, goals and moving towards desired, end states. But it's about the relationship. As you know, coaching is very much about building a relationship. And so in positive psychology, we're ultimately trying to, improve people's lives, and positive relationships are known as the trump card of well-being. Out of all the factors that impact on levels of happiness, although I don't tend to use that word too much, but well-being more broadly, positive relationships are the key. And so if you can use coaching also as a means to develop positive relationships, that's another important component.
Mm. Now, you've published quite a number of works. One of them caught my eye recently was Cognitive Behavioural Solution-Focused Life Coaching, Enhancing Goal-Striving, Wellbeing and Hope. So that's quite a mouthful. Could you walk us through what Cognitive Behavioural Solution-Focused Life Coaching might be?
Yeah, so that actually is the publication from my doctoral research. So... and it was published in the Journal of Positive Psychology back in 2006, and it was actually the first Australian publication. So it's one I'm pretty proud of. And obviously it was my very first research study. I've since done another 3 randomised controlled trials on coaching. But it really, I guess, took a program that Tony Grant had developed at Sydney Uni on what he coined, I guess, cognitive behavioural solution-focused coaching. Really what it is using aspects of cognitive behavioural, well, historically therapy, but really looking at the impact of our thinking and how it impacts on our emotions and on our behaviours. And as most of your listeners, and obviously those working in coaching will know, that it's not that people don't have the ability, it's their thinking that gets in the way of achieving goals in a lot of cases. So the cognitive behavioural aspect is helping to identify thoughts that undermine change and performance, and doing some, I guess, proactive work around shifting mindsets to support goal striving. And then the solution focused part, and again, coaching is defined as being solution focused, which we do naturally. It's helping people find multiple pathways to their goals. As you would know, just the very simple GROW model, that options, where you're constantly saying, what else could you do and what else can you do? So that's sort of that solution-focused approach, which again came out of therapy originally, but what I guess Tony did in his PhD was to take aspects of cognitive behavioural therapy, solution-focused therapy, and apply them to coaching.
And blend them in together, keeping people looking forward, looking for solutions, looking for options and alternatives.
That's exactly right.
And your study was in an education context?
No, it was actually a community study. So I'm a girl from the Gong, from Wollongong, and the University of Wollongong was where I did my doctorate, and we actually opened it up. I went on, I think, ABC local radio, and we recruited, and we had, I think, over 180 people apply, and we ended up with 50, and so 25 went into a group life coaching study, and the other group went into a wait list, which we compared against, and then that wait list also were offered coaching afterwards. But the outcome of that, which that paper is readily available, it's on, I think, academia.edu, which I've uploaded it to as well, free for people to access, basically showed that when people, progress through that type of life coaching program, not only did they make significant progress towards their goals, but they had increases in their well-being, their subjective well-being, which is also known as happiness, if you like, and also their psychological well-being, which covers a broad area of well-being, like positive relationships with others and purpose in life, for example.
Right. Well, so the work that you have since done in positive psychology, you mentioned that some of the application of your work has been in an education environment. Where else have you applied, or have you seen positive psychology applied? So you mentioned a few businesses and organisations that had invested in that.
Yeah, and I think, I actually think education is ahead of the business sector at this point in time. The positive education movement, again, launched here in Australia. Seligman, again, down at Geelong, but I was sort of involved in the early stages in a large program at Knox Grammar, and then Loreto Kirribilli I've been at for the last 2 years. And again, I guess my program is a little different from Seligman's in as much as that I'm using the coaching techniques and coaching psychology techniques. So that field is going gangbusters and, going global. There's now an international positive education network that, with people across the globe looking at it. And in the business sector, because when I finished the doctorate, I went into executive coaching with a colleague, Dr. Travis Kemp, which some of your listeners might know as well, a very well-known executive coach in Australia. And I worked with a lot of large organisations like the Federal Police and PwC, for example. And so because I've done that sort of, since 2004, and then I guess people being aware that I also do positive psych, I've been increasingly running programs in organisations around what I'm calling positivity at work, or strengths at work, picking up on some of the character strengths or performance strengths applications, and also resilience, picking up some of the mental toughness research that's coming out of the UK and Europe as well.
So could you give us a bit of an example, perhaps, or a case study of a place where you've rolled something like this out?
Yeah, and perhaps if I just could give one education and one workplace one. So the education, the larger programs, which, even in the corporate setting, they're sort of, probably the harder ones to come by, which, like a 2-year engagement. But the opportunity and I guess the experience I've had in those programs has been around cultural change. And, after 10 years of working individually with clients, when I started Knox back in 2010, that was quite a large learning curve for me to look at how you actually apply this systemically and across an organisationally wide. And then with Loreto Kirribilli, and then more recently I've been working with the Starlight Children's Foundation, which has been, a wonderful organisation to work with. They're so positive already, so we had a good base to start with. But I guess the approach that I've taken, and I've also engaged some of my associates have stronger organisational development backgrounds than I have myself. I certainly have learned a lot about organisational change and development, but I have brought in experts around that to assist me on those, I guess, larger projects. But generally, we would start off with a training staff. At Knox and Loreto, we trained all of the staff. So we trained 150 at Loreto, which was huge, in small groups of no larger than 30 people at a time. So it was a very large investment in time and cost for the school as well. But at Starlight, we started off just working with the leaders. So I've got a 3-day program that introduces them. Day one, the basics of what is positive psychology, and using a model, PERMA, which is Seligman's wellbeing model. So quite a user-friendly model to introduce people to the key components of positive psychology and strengths. And then day 2, we would do resilience, for example, and aspects as sort of around mental toughness and hardiness. And day 3 in my program, and sometimes I might mix it and make it day 2, but is a day on coaching and evidence-based coaching. So again, with the idea that we can introduce you to these concepts of positive psychology and resilience, but there's no point if you're not going to do anything with them. So I spend usually at least a day giving staff basic coaching training as best as you can. I mean, as you know, you can do a master's in coaching, but as best as we can, giving them some of the key components, around process, using, again, probably GROW just as a simple model, using some of the solution-focused techniques and goal-setting techniques. But we really use that to leverage what they've learned and firstly look at how they're going to apply it to their own lives. And this is really important, particularly in schools where we don't really want teachers taking it out to students if they aren't doing it, I guess, authentically for themselves. But also for leaders. So if leaders can have a sense of how this works before we roll it out to the staff. And then at Starlight, we've since rolled it out to all of the staff at Starlight. And then we've been ongoing consulting to their HR manager around how to sort of hardwire it into their processes through their performance review, looking at all their policies and procedures. Is everything aligned to the philosophy, in a sense, of positive psychology, which is, are we doing whatever we can to bring out the best in people?
Within industry, I can see organisations like Starlight investing in that, paying for that. I wish there were federal funding or grant funding to allow this to take place in schools. Private schools maybe can afford it, but what do public schools do?
Look, that's my dream, Robert. And I've been chipping away at that for a while. I do have a really, I guess, good news story, because often people will say, just as you've said, this is all good for the private schools, but I did do some work with Tully State High, which I don't know if many people will know. It's our wettest place in Australia. It's in far north Queensland, and the principal there heard me speak at a conference and said, this is wonderful, but we're not Geelong Grammar, we're Tully State High, and we don't have any money, and we've just been devastated by Cyclone Yasi. What can we do? So I said to her, well, you've got to find your champions, and you will have champions. Any organisation you go into, particularly if I do a keynote, you can see, people's eyes light up. For some people, they're cynical. You get your broad range of, responses. But if you can really, build on the momentum of the people that go, yes, I love this stuff. I've been reading it for years. I didn't know it had come this far. So try and get your intrinsically motivated people on the ground to form a team that can potentially drive it forward. So, but this principal managed to get a community grant of $50,000, which supported us to train their staff and have ongoing coaching support via phone for a couple of years. But look, there is discussion, I know, in the education department. And if you look down at South Australia, this is a really interesting story in itself. After Seligman was Thinker in Residence, he spent a year down there in Adelaide. The government now have a strategic goal to make South Australia the wellbeing state of the world, which is what we call in coaching a BHAG, a big audacious goal. And again, for people listening, you can Google this and find the strategic documents are available online. It's a very aspirational goal. And look, I don't know, my BHAG is to improve the wellbeing of the world and through coaching and positive psych. And I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but I think it is an aspirational goal. And they talk about creating activating hubs of community wellbeing in South Australia and with schools at the centre, but bringing in workplaces and other community organisations and, public service. It is in the very early days in South Australia, but I would say, watch that space. But yeah, so there is some discussions, but we've got a bit of a way to go yet, unfortunately.
Yeah. We found a one-off grant that was being made available through a local Chamber of Commerce and the Canberra State Government, ACT State Government, and they allowed 20 teachers, 2 from each school from 7 schools, as a pilot to get coach training so they could go back in and deal with students who were disconnecting from the system. But replicating that is mission impossible. So, I really hope that you're able to forge your way ahead, and South Australia sounds like they're going ahead and doing it.
It certainly does. But yeah, again, people out there just keep talking to, trying to be influential, and if we can just keep talking about the need for it. And the other thing is the parents. So there is a couple of public schools that I'm working with in a smaller way. So some, training of a group of champions and some ongoing coaching of their leader to implement, positive education. But that came about through the P&F, so it was the parents that went to the school and said, we want this for our kids and we're prepared to raise some money to fund it. So that's another way that it's happening out there at the moment.
Through interested and engaged parents.
Yeah, and the other thing, again, for people that work in organisations, I recently did a talk last year for a very large global investment bank, and the HR person that had brought me in, she said, oh, goodness, one of our absolute senior directors is here and he never comes to these talks. And so I went over to introduce myself, and he said, I'm here because I want to know about this positive education and I want to know which school to send my kids to, But in that sense, you can also, when I talk in schools, there's often, people that want to then bring it into their workplace. And then when I talk in workplaces, there are people that want to bring it into their school. So I always make sure that I talk about both of those areas because, it's a nice way to continue to get the word out there.
Mm. Well, why don't we turn now to the topic of the coaching industry? So I guess you've come into the industry from maybe not the academic side, but from the university education side. What do you see as its greatest challenges?
I guess it probably is still defined as an industry at this point in time. So I think, and over the years since I've been in there, so from 2000, 2001, and from when the coaching psychology unit was set up, we've certainly seen some rigour brought to it, which has been quite inspiring for me. Yourself and listeners will probably know that a few years ago, Standards Australia, there are a group of people here in Australia, leaders in coaching, that work together to create a document. Again, you can, I think you have to purchase it, but it's a document that a lot of organisations have taken up as a guide to understanding what is coaching, what's the difference between mentoring, consulting and training. In the early days when I came into it, people purchasing coaching, like even in the large organisations, there was a lot of confusion around what it was. And, there is a place for mentoring and consulting and counselling and coaching, but there was a lot of confusion around what those fields were, how they overlapped and who was the best person to provide them. And I think we've seen that start, that's definitely shifted, and so that's really good. And I think also for people coming into it, I get lots of emails from people saying, how did you get to be where you are today? And I certainly don't think that everybody has to do a psychology degree to be a great coach, but I think what the Coaching Psychology Masters has done, which, as you would know, most of the students that have been through that are not psychologists. They've been the minimum really that have come through my class. But what the course has done really well is to take the most important and best aspects of psychology that are applicable to coaching. So again, I'm not saying you have to do a master's, but I would at the very least, if you're moving into coaching, think about some sort of counselling training, whether it's Lifeline, who do fabulous training, basic training skills in, rapport building. And so you really can't coach if you don't have those basic micro skills, which most people realise. And I think, again, I think there's some greater recognition that just due to the prevalence of particularly disorders like depression and anxiety, that it will come up. And I think more so in that life coaching industry, but it does come up in the workplace industry as well. And that you do need to have, some knowledge of mental illness, and doing a course like Mental Health First Aid, which is a brilliant course here in Australia, highly recommended for coaches to do that course. Because, the assumption that we don't work with people with, we do coaching, we don't work with mental illness, it's flawed just because of the statistics. So you do need to know how to recognise it, and you do need to know how to refer on.
Well, that does bring us back to the issue we mentioned at the start, was dealing with mental health issues in coaching. So coaches aren't psychologists; they're not trained to deal with those issues. Probably can't even necessarily identify them clinically. So what do you do? Let's say there's a coach and he or she is been in practice 5 or 6 years. They've put in a couple of 100 hours, maybe 1,000 hours, something like that, and they're seeing clients with these issues. What would your best practice suggestion be?
I guess from a professional development perspective, if you've been in it a long time, you probably have had some of this experience anyway. I would think just through experience, but I really do think getting some professional training around mental health, understanding mental illness, and again, that mental health first aid is a very good course to do. Mm-hmm. In the coaching masters at Sydney Uni and some of the new coaching masters popping up around the world, there are course work that actually, so the students will cover that as part of the subject in understanding those disorders or personality issues as well. So I think if you're serious about being a coach and having it as a career, it really for me is a key component of your training. And as you said, most coaches and the students I've worked with, there were over 500 students I had through the coaching psychology masters. Most people don't want to do therapy. They don't want to work in that area, which I completely understand because I don't do that anymore either. And the other thing is, this is a bit of a funny story, Robert. I was in the UK a few years ago, and it sounds a bit like a joke, but I was sitting with an American, or he was Canadian actually, but an Englishman, and of course I'm the Australian, and the conversation come up about coaching and therapy, and the Englishman said, "Oh no, if you're doing therapy, you can't have coaching." So I'm not doing a very good English accent there, but he was very strict about therapy and coaching being very separate, and they shouldn't be near each other. And then I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "I'm a little bit more grey around that area, and probably because I'm equipped to work across the spectrum, but I also know, as I've matured as a coach, when I'm doing executive coaching, I might recognise that there might be some, in some cases it might be a clinical anxiety disorder that comes up. I don't treat that in exec coaching, but I would make a referral to a clinical psych or a psychiatrist if the case may be. But I, in many cases, would continue to work with that executive coaching client to support them in the workplace at the same time as they're having therapy. Now, that may not work in every case. You really need to make an individual assessment around that. In some cases, it might mean stopping the coaching and the therapy needs to, is most important, and the person needs to give all of their energy to that. But I'm much more grey around that area. And then it came to the American and the Canadian. He goes, "Oh, goodness," he goes, "we have everything. We have therapy, marriage counselling, coaching." So I thought that was quite funny. I
guess you could do them concurrently if the psychologist isn't offering, or the coach isn't offering, conflicting advice. So you're not working at odds against each other.
That's it. And if you can, as a coach, well, again, some of the students that I've had over the years, they would, possibly ring me and say, Suzy, do you have a recommendation for a referral? I've, identified this. I've had a discussion with the client. I'm just looking for a good referral. In that case, I would certainly recommend that they try and talk to the psychologist and, determine whether the coaching is still appropriate. And in many cases, as I said, it may very well be, and it might be there to support it. Particularly, I'm talking about in workplace coaching, to continue to support the coachee in the workplace, but they may be, having extra support around other areas or, aspects of counselling even with a therapist.
Now, congratulations on your recent appointment to another professorship, University of Western Sydney.
It's my first one, actually.
Oh, your first one? Okay.
Yeah.
So generally, people who are involved in lecturing or education or who have associate professorship work end up writing a book of their, condensing their thoughts down. Have you got anything in the pipeline?
Well, yeah, it's funny you should say that, Robert. So over the years, again, I don't really consider myself to be an academic. I've got, now 4 honorary academic positions, but I have published, I think, nearly 10 book chapters on primarily coaching and positive psychology, and about 8 journal articles in the peer-reviewed press, so all very academic in nature. And because I've sort of been out there speaking more broadly, and I'm constantly asked, do you have a book, a book for the general public? So I have an agent and I'm working on that now, but it's been really challenging. I've actually needed some coaching because it took me so long to learn to write as an academic, and now I've had feedback that I'm writing too academically and I've got to start to write, more, broadly for the general public. So that book, it's probably going to be still close to a year away, but it'll take, I guess, my learnings, particularly in the personal coaching, which I've done lots of over the years, in helping people, change their lives really, but using coaching and positive psychology to do that. So it'll be a sort of a self-help book to apply coaching and positive psychology. So there's that book, and then there's also another book I've got with Professor Stephen Palmer, which again some of your listeners will know. He really has driven the coaching psychology agenda in the UK and Europe for many years. He's a leader in coaching psychology, and Stephen and I have a contract with Routledge. It's an edited book on positive psychology coaching in practice. So we've got a number of authors in Australia, the US and the UK that will write about aspects of positive psychology and how they can be used in coaching. So stay posted for that one too.
2 books in the pipeline. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to say to our listeners?
No, I think, for a while I've been presenting the coaching conferences, have sort of sat separately, and the positive psych conferences have sat separately, and I speak at both, and usually I tell the coaching people, come along to the positive psych conferences, and the positive psych people, I'll say, come along to the coaching conferences. So it'd be great to eventually have a combined, I guess, conference. And there is some rumours that there will actually be a combined Masters in Positive Psychology and Coaching Psychology coming out of the UK later in the year. I can't announce all the details for that yet, but for those people that are interested in, it's going to be offered distance education, which means that our Australian listeners in particular, or the people not based in the UK, could do that. Often I hear people go, I don't know, if I'm up to university, I would certainly consider it. Again, I've had plenty of students come through and have been coaching for many years, and they've said to me, well, number one, it's confirmed for me that a lot of the work I'm doing is good work, and I'm proud of what I've done, but it's also really given me a solid, scientific underpinning to my work, and broadened, some aspects of my understanding of coaching. So I'd encourage people to perhaps consider some further training there as well.
Right. And you've mentioned the United Kingdom and the fact that it will be coming up with this Masters with both fields in it. I remember your connection to the Wellbeing Institute at Cambridge, and just curious how that came about.
Yeah, so that actually was set up by Professor Felicia Huppert, who is a world expert on wellbeing. She consulted to David Cameron in the UK, which no small job, looking at the wellbeing of the country of UK. But Felicia's actually an Australian, and she taught at Cambridge. She's still there for 6 months of the year, and but she recently has taken an appointment here at ACU, Australian Catholic University, and ACU have set up an Institute for Positive Psychology and Education, and Felicia will be there, I think, for about 6 months of the year here and 6 months in Cambridge. And Felicia I met a number of years ago, and I guess she was impressed with particularly the work in education that I was doing, and Felicia's also very much about mental health promotion. So how do we as a community, how do we shift mental health so more people are flourishing than languishing? And Felicia's very strong around offering programs through schools and through workplaces to ultimately prevent mental illness. So I also was given an honorary position at this institute at ACU. And I might just give it a quick plug. We do have a conference coming up in June, Saturday the 6th of June, at the Strathfield campus at Australian Catholic University. And we have Professor Barbara Fredrickson as our keynote speaker. And Barb is one of the, big guns in positive psychology. She's the creator of the broaden and build theory of positive emotions, which is one of the foundational theories of positive psychology. So it's a great opportunity to come. We also have Dr. Christian van Nieuwenburg, who is the program leader in the Coaching Psychology Masters at University of East London. We have Michelle McQuaid, who's a fabulous executive coach and trainer and is ex-PricewaterhouseCoopers herself, and she'll be presenting a workshop. So, it'd be great for people to have a look at that. I think that'd be a great PD opportunity.
Brilliant. I'm glad you got to mention that.
Yeah, thank you.
And if our listeners want to read any of the other 10 chapters that you've already published, albeit that they're a little academic, where would they find those?
Yeah, so I recently, I do believe you have to sign up as a member. There's no cost, but academia.edu. And I've posted most of my journal articles. The book chapters, I don't think I have, I'm not able to post the book chapters, but I'm happy to send through my CV, which lists all of the readings, but people can email me through the info at thepositivityinstitute.com.au, and we're happy to send a copy of some of the chapters. One that might be of particular interest is one that I wrote with Dr. Gordon Spence, who's also done a lot of great work in coaching research as well, on evidence-based coaching as a positive psychology intervention. And that's in the Handbook of Positive Psychology Interventions, which is a big text. But I've got that chapter that I could send through if people are interested in that.
Okay, and it's otherwise academia.edu. Sign up there; it's free, and just look for Dr. Gordon Spence and yourself.
Yes, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, Suzy, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. And I just thought of one other thing, and it's a bit short notice, but the International Positive Psychology Association conference is coming up the end of June, and it's going to be held in the best place for a positive psychology conference to be held, which is Disney World in Florida. So, and there's quite a few Australians going. I'll be presenting on positive psychology in higher education, which we really didn't talk about today. So there's a lot happening in the university sector as well. But yeah, look, it'll be a wonderful opportunity to learn more about positive psychology if people are interested in looking for a holiday as well.
So Florida, Disney World, positive psychology, end of June.
That's it.
Brilliant. Well, thanks again, Suzy.
Thank you, Robert.
You're welcome. Well, listeners, thanks for joining us today. And remember to go to the podcast page and click on this episode. And at the end, I have put a very lengthy series of notes from today, linking you out to the books, the websites, the organisations. Particularly, I want you to go and have a look at thepositivityinstitute.com.au, and you'll find out Suzy's work that she does around the place. And I'm sure that you'll find some great resources there. So thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to you being with us next time.
You've been listening to the Coach Mentor podcast. Find us on the website at www.fraserholmes.com/podcast. Join us next time for another exciting instalment of the Coach Mentor podcast.